Just for the record, today is March 9th, 2023, and I'm Harvey Tananbaum, and John Carlo. Both of us work at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and we're with George Field, the founding director of the CFA, and we're going to have a nice discussion of some of the early days and some of the history going back about 50 years now.
Yeah, great introduction.
So, George, I think I don't know very much about the decisions you were making in the early 70s to join the faculty and come to Harvard.
Yes.
But can you tell us just a little bit about how you were, quote unquote, recruited and what your thoughts were about joining Harvard?
I'm happy to do so. I first learned that Harvard was interested in having me as director of the Harvard College Observatory, which is now half of the new CFA, from Edward Purcell, who was a physics professor at Harvard. He had a home in New Hampshire, and he went there in the summer. I also had a home in New Hampshire. I got a call from him, "We would like you to come over for lunch." So we drove over. I sat with him on the porch looking out at the mountains, and he said, "George, we would like you to be the director of the Harvard Observatory." I did a double take, triple take. This can't be happening to me. At that point, I was a professor at Berkeley and had been for 1 year the chairman of the department. That was the sum total of my management experience. I took it seriously and started thinking about it. That is how I was recruited. Now, you might ask, why he? I had a history with N. Purcell. He was a Nobel Prize winner for the discovery of nuclear magnetic resonance, which is now very commercially available. And when I was a graduate student at Princeton, there was an opportunity to join a group at Harvard called the Society of Fellows. You may have heard of it. My supervisor, Lyman Spitzer, knew Ed Purcell. They had worked together or something. Ed asked Lyman, "Do you have a person who might be a candidate for this thing?" I was the candidate. I was accepted, and I ended up working with Ed Purcell. At that time, they had just discovered the 21 centimeter line, and there were some questions about the physics, and so I worked on that with Ed. So that's how I knew Ed, that's how he knew me, and he must have sold the idea to the committee. That's how it happened.
Wow. Connections.
Connection, you bet. I believe in them all the way along the line.
We talk a little bit about the idea of somehow joining the Smithsonian Observatory and the Harvard College Observatory to form the CFA, the Center for Astrophysics.
Sure, okay. When I learned of this possible appointment, I came to Cambridge with the idea of speaking to the senior people, and I did so, and it became evident that many of the people I was interviewing were not Harvard, they were Smithsonian. The main focus of the Smithsonian was interplanetary objects, particularly those that encountered the Earth, because it was the central interest of Fred Whipple, the director. I did not agree that in the early 70s we should be devoting millions to the study of comets. I have great respect for Fred Whipple, and so I began wondering what was going to be the relationship with him. His relationship with the Harvard Observatory had to some extent deteriorated. He was one professor in the department, and he had a vote there, but he was operating independently with a very significant budget, right? And there was some friction with Leo Goldberg. Leo was the director of the Harvard Observatory. He had stamped the Harvard Observatory as a center for research on the sun. Sun, comets, no, cosmology. Okay. Since they were offering me a job in which I would have to interact with Fred, I wasn't sure that I would do any better than Leo. But Leo, he was a very fine gentleman who understood all of these things, and I could talk to him. He said that he had talked to Ricardo about joining what then was the Harvard Observatory. And he told me something very interesting, that there was an official at NASA who said, you know, Ricardo, if you could find an academic position, we could sell your program better, because we are making an effort at NASA to support academic work.
Yeah, and Ricardo at that point was the executive VP at American Science and Engineering, which was a private company, very different from an academic position.
Oh, yeah, I knew that, of course. Can I throw in a little intelligence that I have never been able to figure out? I was an assistant professor at Princeton, and Lyman came into my office and said, we're going to the Institute for lunch. I want you to meet somebody. It was Ricardo. Why? The Institute.
He had a fellowship and come to the U.S. And he was in Indiana for a year or two doing cloud chamber work and building a better detector for cosmic rays.
Yeah.
And that fellowship that he had allowed him to spend some time at Princeton or the Institute as part of the 3 years that the program ran. And I think he felt he'd gone about as far as he could at Indiana, and it was time to move. And there must have been someone he collaborated with at Princeton. And I think he met Herb Gursky there, and they became quite a team for the next couple of decades. But that fellowship ran out, and he still really hadn't found a calling for himself. And that's when the opportunity arose to join American Science and Engineering, and he moved to Cambridge and eventually, very quickly, in fact, got into X-ray astronomy within a year or two, the idea of building detectors for X-rays and telescopes for X-rays. But Princeton there was somebody there working on cosmic ray work, either at Princeton or the Institute, that he came to work with on that fellowship for another year.
I was impressed with the fact that we were immediately whisked into Oppenheimer's office. So I had the impression there was something cooking there, right?
Could you place roughly a year? Was that around 1956 or 7?
Yeah.
So I would say the truth is...
I got my PhD there in 55.
Yeah.
And then I went back as an assistant professor the next year. So it would have been 56, 57, yes.
With all due respect to Ricardo, I don't think he was that well known or that established at that point in his career. And so why he and you were given that red carpet, I couldn't begin to guess. But he may have caught somebody's eye already, as a very ambitious and interesting individual.
Yes, maybe Lyman's eye. I never heard Lyman talk about him, but I'm sure he respected him as I did.
So you were at the point where you were figuring out what your relationship with Whipple might be, and obviously you became the director for the joint CFA in both the Smithsonian and the Harvard College Observatory.
Right.
Did that proceed relatively smoothly, or were there pros and cons, and the people that were not excited about the idea?
There was one person who was vigorously opposed, a professor, and so we need not go into it. He did not make a big fuss, he made a small fuss. I had that idea, let's just do it. Both of them. So obviously one issue comes up immediately. What about Fred? There was an assistant secretary of the Smithsonian for Science. His name was David Challenger. He took it up with a guy named Jim Bradley, who seemed to be a fix-it man. And he said, let me discuss it with the secretary, okay? And they decided that they could interpret the personnel rules and so on so as to say that it was time for him to retire. He had the honor of that whole group who all respected him tremendously. And I was happy with it because I met him. I had not known him before. And I realized what a fine scientist he was.
That's really an interesting story. And the fix-it guy, obviously, there are people like that at every stage. Having people like that as part of your team is an amazing thing to have. That's for sure. When the CFA was being organized, I think it officially started the beginning of July of 1973. So we're almost to the 50th anniversary within a few months of that.
I know.
But there must have been months of planning that went into it and deciding how to structure it. And you ended up with these 7 or 8 scientific divisions.
Yes.
How did that all come about? How did that process work?
Well, yes, very much so. I took a year off from Berkeley. I had the house in New Hampshire. I moved there and decided to come down and talk to as many people in the CFA as I could, and got the feeling that it would work if we did it right. And since I had little management experience, I had to do it as I go. And it seemed to me that, first of all, there were many different fields being pursued, not only comets and solar. There would be an X-ray or high-energy division. These people don't think of themselves as working at an observatory. They think of themselves as pursuing a field of research. And because they are interested, if you want to get them on your team, you set things up so that you're not standing in the way of their work. You're trying to help them with their work. Okay? That means they have to have control, at least some control, of the program and the budget of their field. I thought maybe they could have a system where there is a person who is recognized as a leader of that field, who is between the director who has final authority and the guy at the desk. And as I went around and talked to people and tried out various schemes, it seemed that that was an acceptable way of doing things. So I called them associate directors, one level above the assistant director, who was the budget man. So it seemed to work, and
probably helped with recruitment of some of the people that you were trying to attract.
Yes, of course. In particular, Ricardo wouldn't have done anything for anything less than that. That may have been marginal. In fact, let me make a statement about his participation. I don't know for a fact, but I think he had a different conception of his role when I talked to him about it than I did. I think he thought that I was telling him I would be the director on paper, but he would be the director of the whole smear.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that, but it's possible. I was just a kid in those days, so it's not likely that he would have shared those ideas.
I was a kid, too, and at that time I was in my 40s, right?
As was Ricardo, by the way. We were all kids. Ricardo was in his late 30s.
Well, I admired him no end. The better I knew him, the more I admired him.
Were there other people who recruited at the same time? Did Al Cameron join, for
Yes,
example?
at the same time, yeah. And that was an odd situation in a way. Why Al? We could go into details, but I'd known Al for a long time. He was plugged into the advisory apparatus at NASA, and he was working on a specific theoretical problem, which is a significant problem, the origin of the moon. And he published his work on that, and I think it's widely accepted. But he had a solid reputation as a nuclear physicist who was very well informed on the whole issue of the origin of the elements. He could have been in the group that won the Nobel Prize for that, but he wasn't. Smart guy, I liked him. That's how it happened. I tapped him and he said yes.
Did he come in as a theoretician primarily then?
He's hard to label.
Yeah, I understand.
Because he has his hands on the experiments too.
Sure.
But anyway, he came in and I had to sell him and Ricardo to the university. I don't know if you know the system, but it's very interesting. You end up in the president's office, right? And there are a group of people who have been invited, experts and so on. And the chairman or director or whatever who was proposing the candidate does so. And these experts listen. Has he made a good case or her a good case? And the president, who happened to be a lawyer at the time, listens and is making a decision that is far out of his field, right? He knows nothing about it.
So who were a few of the other senior people that, you put into leadership roles at that point? What other names come to mind besides Ricardo and Al?
Yeah. One person comes to mind immediately, Alex Del Garno. And I was very sorry to hear about his death. He played an important role. He was the temporary director of HL when Leo left. He occupied an important position. This machinations depended upon his maturity to be in a position of power, but not to exercise it too much. He was a temporary director. He was the prime person who had a say, I would say. And of course, he was in touch with all of the professors and what they thought. And you remember I said there was one that was dead against this sort of arrangement.
If we look at those first 10 years or so,
Yeah.
It was obviously starting from scratch with this new structure and so many new people and new fields of interest. How do you think it went? What were some of your challenges? What was your management style and how did it evolve over those 10 years?
Yes. First of all, I have to say I'm not a manager. Other people are managers, but I'm not. I'm a guy who has certain scientific priorities and tastes. And I thought of my position as one where I say yes or no. You guys know this stuff. Come in, we'll talk, and I'll say yes or no. And I have certain tastes in scientists. For example, I admired Ricardo. And I had to say no to him once. That was quite something.
Well, that would go in the category of one of your challenges then.
Yes. It lasted about 5 minutes, but it was a memorable 5 minutes. One of the failures that I had, maybe the biggest failure, was the solar physics division. To make a long story short, there was a scientist who didn't perform well, and we found out too late to save the contract. The contract was canceled by NASA after a Tiger team came up and blasted us. And that's because my management style did not extend to poking around in any division management. I just had confidence in the guy I had appointed. The guy who didn't perform was in the engineering side, and the guy I had appointed was not an expert in engineering. Things got out of hand, and we suffered from that major budget loss.
Yeah, I think when we first started out in '73, the prospects for future projects and the bulk of the funding was really much more on the Harvard College Observatory side, and then in the '70s it swung much more to the Smithsonian side.
Oh yeah, no question.
Yeah.
Your contracts were vitally important.
But just navigating the place through those kinds of changes had to be, whether you see yourself as a manager or not, you somehow kept the place together and navigated through that kind of a transition.
Okay, it was John Gregory who was the key to that. He had been a project manager at NASA. He knew the ropes of NASA, right, very well. And he insulated me from the dirty details. It worked at some level. That's all I can say. You had a guy, an internal John Gregory for your project.
Oh, Ben Rowe. Ricardo knew Ben Rowe from AS&E, and even before we came over from AS&E to CFA, Ben started a month or two before and helped to figure out the office situation and be able to set up the financial stuff. And so it was Ben Rowe, I'm pretty sure, he was the division administrator, is what we called the people.
And most divisions ended up having such a person, which was good for me. I enjoyed independence from the financial work of each division. I was just sitting there saying yes or no. That's what
But saying yes or no, you didn't, I'm sure, say yes or no until you had some sense of what you were being asked and making some kind of an informed decision of what you thought was best for the science, for the observatory, for the people involved. So it is not quite so simple as saying yes or no. That's your management style in a sense that we're talking about, right?
Yes, it is. You are absolutely right. I had to go with information that was supplied by one person, John Gregory. It was filtered through him, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
He was the guy who would tell me who the key players are, were they up to the job, and so on. So that is an important point.
Looking back at the decade, it's always easy to say, I might have done this differently or that differently, but just looking at it as a whole and then, projecting what's happened over the 40 years since then, how would you categorize the experiment of forming the Joint Center?
B+.
Do you want to elaborate at all?
Well, as I mentioned, there were some serious problems involving the solar physics, right? But on the whole, I think the reputation of the place is positive. It's had a positive effect on astronomy. Just counting the high energy work alone is sensationally successful. If we could narrow it down to the article he wrote I was referring to, that's a tremendous achievement.
Thank you very much. I mean, everything has its challenges.
Oh, yeah.
And we had this unique environment in which we were not a university. High Energy Group was primarily on the Smithsonian side. It was primarily funded with NASA contracts and grants, which made us aware that our future depended on our success. But the environment was such that we were not working against the tenure clock. We were in an environment that was scholarly. It didn't have the full government bureaucratic weight on it, but we had a lot of freedom to build the projects and be in a research environment. It wasn't industry, it wasn't the government, it wasn't the university. It was this unique mix of things. we were in a situation where management did enable us to do the things we set out to do. Fostering that environment, it grew in a sort of an ecological kind of a way. I mean, I don't know that anybody could have laid out a blueprint. If I had to write down an organization chart, people's heads would have exploded. But the reality is, it was a situation that grew out of what was created, that enabled us to do a lot of important work very effectively.
Amen. However, I would highlight the importance of the nature and the character of Ricardo. Would you say that you could have done all that without Ricardo?
Absolutely not.
Okay. That's what I was
The
looking
project
for.
that launched in 1999 with the name Chandra was the outgrowth of a white paper that he wrote a year after the first discovery of SCO-X-1 in the background.
Yeah.
He wrote a paper about a 1.2 meter X-ray telescope, a white paper laying out the future of the field, expecting to accomplish it all in less than a decade, and it took us about 25 or 30 years more to get there.
Yeah, sure.
But the reality is, he had this vision of what we needed to make the field so much more powerful than just the initial rocket and balloon flights.
Oh, sure.
And he empowered those of us who were younger, the Leon and Spaybrooks, the Steve Murrays, the Harvey Tananbaums, to do the things we were able to do with the knowledge that if we had a question or a problem, he would be there to discuss it. But we had this very nurturing relationship which allowed us to grow, but knew there was a bit of a safety net underneath.
Yes.
It was not just Ricardo's vision, but also the way he interacted with his team. It was amazing.
Extraordinarily talented fellow. Let me mention an encounter that impressed me. When he won the Nobel Prize, that put him in a position where he was invited to sit around a table with the other Nobel Prize winners that year. And it was broadcast on GBH. It was extraordinary. He dominated this group of 12 people, not only in the scientific way, but in a human way. He revealed the breadth of his character. Astonishing.
When you step down as the director,
Yeah.
I think there was an interim of a year or more till your successor was actually chosen and in place. You stayed at the observatory and you continued to teach and do research.
Yes.
How did that work for you?
Fine. I came to it as a professor and I left as a professor, right? The big jump was when I retired. I had been teaching and researching and so on. And I had been part of the theory group. That sounds impressive, but actually it meant going to lunch with Bill Press. Bill was an entertaining fellow, and we would listen to his exploits. My office, when I retired, was across the hall from the room where we had lunch. And as I walked out, I felt disempowered in some sense. Incredible shrinking scientist. But I got over that, right? And right now I am again doing research on a problem in cosmology with another fellow who's a former student. Honestly, it's the most innovative idea I ever had. The paper has been in the works for 2 or 3 years now. It's coming to fruition. I'm getting the nearly final version and so on. To pursue the idea, which is a solid idea, I had to invent a concept that I've never seen in print. My colleague, John Carroll, is a brilliant fellow in command of general relativity, particularly cosmology and so on. So he is plumbing the depths of that side. It's basically MHD. I contribute the MHD, he contributes relativity. So it's a mixture. I think the basic idea is it's based on axions. We start with the hypothesis that the axions are the dark matter, and we follow the general knowledge of axions. Of course, they have not been detected. And we follow up on the interaction with the electromagnetic field. I am very pleased with that. Gee, it's been great to see you again, and I appreciate your participation. Is there anything else? It's so fine to see you again.